because I managed to, okay, so welcome everyone. We have some people that are visiting online. We have some visitors. That's very nice. Thanks to all of us for joining into our, it's a kind of midterm discussion of the results of our Jean Monnet network. So I have to say that this meeting is registered. So I hope everybody is okay. Taped, now registered, like video recorded. Like it's a Zoom meeting and it's video recorded, so everything we will say will be eternalized. And we also wanted to upload it. So the link on the website. So as a warning, so I hope you are okay. If not, well, you can opt out. Okay, so we'll have a kind of like literally a roundtable discussion. I will sit down in a minute after I've been doing the welcoming and everything. And I just have 2 slides. I promise it's not more of presentation of the Jean Monnet network. So those people around the table are the bulk of the participants of the Jean Monnet network debating Europe. And I'll just briefly explain who they are and what that is. So it's an EU-funded project with the support of the Erasmus program. It's part of the Jean Monnet program. It's a 4-year project. It's 4 years because of the pandemic. So originally it was planned to be 3 years, but because of what we do focus group discussions with students, and focus group discussions have to be carried out live. And we had a pandemic where for 2 years it was barely possible to meet in presence. So we got a prolongation, so it's a 4-year project now. So we are now starting the last year of the project and discussing our interim findings. So there's me, I'm Claudia Wisner. I'm a professor at this university here, Fulda University of Applied Sciences, with a focus on political science and European integration. Then there is the Institute Inter-Research with 2 members that cannot be present here because they have another workshop taking place in parallel, Thomas Berger and Markus Fessler. Then we have our colleagues from Lyon, Cécile Robert, who is there, and Willy Beauvallet, who somehow escaped behind. That's not fair. You will have to return to the table. Then we have the University of Zagreb, which is represented by Professor Matan. And there's also her colleague Igor Vidčak and a bit Tonči participating in the project. Then we have the University of Ljubljana, represented by Novak, with her colleagues Damjan, Lajh and Danica, Fink, Hafner. Helsinki University with Niilo, Kauppi and Kim Zilliacus. And the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, sorry for still keeping to forget that the E, there should be an E missing in the label with Ruzha Smilova. So we sort of started from this thing or level of research and opinion service diagnosing a gap between what can be termed EU allies and EU citizens. It's not only that support rates for the EU have been decreasing, it's especially that even since well after the financial crisis, votes for populist, extremist, anti-EU and anti-democrat parties and movements are on the rise. So throughout Europe, we all see that. But we also have an ongoing European integration of politics and decision-making, which transforms the national democratic systems. So one frame that is taken for granted is that the increase in right-wing and populist parties is in part a counter-reaction against ongoing European integration. Even if we don't look at the right-wing parties, we really have a kind of EU criticism that is there. And it was the goal of the project to inquire into what are the reasons for being critical of the European Union. So the idea that this network has is one to go beyond the classical approaches, which would be quantitative approaches. So which would be approaches that ask citizens on a scale of 1 to 10, are you critical or not critical of the European Union, for instance? And then they do a kind of aggregated finding. So Eurobarometer data are very much what I'm after here, where there's a representative survey and you will know very well on the average what Germans or French people or Croatian people think about the European Union. But you will not know why, because they don't give you so many explanations about why they think the EU is a good thing or a bad thing. So the idea of the project was that we wanted to go behind what are the reasons for people saying I'm not exactly in favor of or against or whatsoever. So we wanted to use debate as a methodology in research, but also to integrate teaching and research activities and to enhance an exchange. So what we do here tonight is a kind of exchange, obviously. Yeah. So we want to get into a debate with you in the audience and with you online about the results. Need to click go one slide down. So what we did as the core of the projects, and we are going to discuss tonight about the results of that part of the project, is that we did focus group discussions in Bulgaria, Croatia, Germany, France, Finland, and Slovenia. Because it was the pandemic, we did something that I'm now actually delighted about. We couldn't do what most focus group projects have done so far and discuss with what is called the ordinary citizens. We said, okay, so we turn the vice into a virtue, and we are going to discuss the EU with our master students in European studies. So master students in European studies is, according to most opinion surveys, are the group that should be the most Europe positive. Because they are very well educated, they have a direct and positive experience with the European Union, so that they should be fervent EU supporters. So it was very interesting what we found out. Because still then, I'm putting here, it's a group of people with an ambivalent relation to democracy, so they are not, at least not our master's students, fervent supporters of representative democracy. They are critical of the performance of the democratic system sometimes, and they see problems, but in general, they are rather politicized. But we have 6 countries, so we were expecting we would see some national variation. Because when you look at the Eurobarometer, there are some countries that are traditionally very EU enthusiastic, and there are some countries that are traditionally very EU critical. So, what did we want to know? We wanted to know about what are the reasons for shrinking support for the EU and democracy. We wanted to know what are the sources of criticism of the EU and democracy. And we wanted to know why people identify or not as a European, and we wanted to know which topics they see as politicized. And in a broad framework, we wanted to know what are the reasons. So what is this gap that sort of we see between elites and citizens, and does it actually exist? And just to throw some key general findings at you, we have much more, but this is just a short introduction. We came to the conclusion that our master students are critically informed EU citizens. So they know a lot, they have a lot of support and sympathy for the integration project, but they have a kind of well-grounded, informed EU criticism, which is not, and that's a main conceptual finding, to be confused with Euroscepticism. Just because they say we don't like the EU as it is, and we see A, B, C, D detailed problems, it is not as if they are against the EU. On the contrary, it's more like a kind of disappointment with the European Union. So it's a feeling of the EU being a good project, a model of supranational democracy, but too complex, too intransparent, not up to its aims. Interesting was also that they have similar perceptions of crisis fields. So migration, climate, COVID, and the war against Ukraine are seen as the most pressing issues of the European Union in the moment. And they also have a similar perception of standard bearers of the EU. So passport, citizenship, the EU's institutions get a rather positive evaluation in the focus groups. And interestingly, the EU leaders have a kind of key role. And let me add one finding that we have been discussing just before you came. So a striking finding, something that struck me because we are talking about students, is that when asked for the remedies, they said, oh, what the EU could do is more education, more information, more social media. And we're just discussing that the students apparently don't think it's our task to make the EU better, but they just thought it's the EU's task to make the EU better. It's the EU's task to inform the students, whereas democracy obviously has a kind of bottom-up component. So it should be citizens that make democracy, at least also. Yeah, okay, so that would be my introduction. And I think there's nothing sort of that sort of decisively more to say on my impressions on the focus group or so, or on the German case. I can add that in this discussion, so I will just pass the micro around. we have been saying that this is a kind of roundtable discussion, and Virginie van Ingelgom, she's one member of our academic advisory board, warm welcome. She had a huge experience with systems output, namely the German train service today. So, and let me say that it is like a very usual these days. So she made it, yay. She arrived at 5:45 in Fulda. So we would really be looking forward to your comments. So the idea is that each panelist gives a brief impression of the findings of the focus groups, and then we enter, and the audience obviously can ask questions, and those people that are present online can do that too. So let's just start over. Let's start with data.
So greetings also from my side. I'll share the sort of the insight into the focus groups that were organized at the University of Ljubljana, more specifically Faculty of Social Sciences. We conducted a series of focus groups in 2 years, so in 2020 and 23, with MA students or master students that are taking part in the course of EU policy making, so which makes a ground of their knowledge about the EU. So actually they do have some insight in how EU is working, and they also express this so that they have the interest in how EU operates, and they have this interest also beyond their studies, not just to acquire information necessary for them to pass the course, but also, as they claim it, we're part of the EU. EU has an everyday effect on our lives, so we need to know more about the EU, and we find this important. For this, up until now, we were able to analyze partially 4 focus groups. So I'll base my findings on those focus groups that were conducted mainly with Slovenian students. We conducted some also with Erasmus students and students coming from EU candidate countries, which are also interesting, but we couldn't analyze them up until now yet. What we observed in our focus groups is that basically students have this similar image about the EU, and we could split this image about the EU in 3 categories. So in one hand, they see EU benefits and recognize EU benefit, and then EU institutions as a sort of a symbol of the functioning of European Union, and lastly, EU policies that have a sort of effect on how the sort of the things are working. In terms of EU benefits, they mostly recognize free movement, sort of easier traveling through to Schengen and a common euro. So they sort of portray this image of European citizens being able to cross the borders quicker than others in terms of traveling. But they also emphasize the importance of Erasmus exchange, because this is somehow they first-handedly experienced the EU, where they had this option of sort of networking with other students and building on EU identity. And they saw this experience also as an opportunity for equal access to education, equal rights. In terms of EU institutions, they recognize mostly this importance of democracy and direct elections, representation, and also equal parts of all member states in policy making. But here it's important to note that some of the students also noted that they see particularly collaboration and working together of France and Germany as the 2 most recognized member states as something that EU is. You know, this ability for these 2 countries that historically were seen on dispute to basically collaborate in EU. Lastly, in terms of the EU policies, I think they recognize on one hand the challenges that contemporary society is facing today, and at the same time also EU. So policies on migration, policy on climate change, possibly also transport and common agriculture, but also sort of the challenges related to demographic change. But at the same time also this responsibility that they assign to the EU in terms of that EU is a global actor and can have a sort of a say these policies and changes that would go beyond just the effects of the EU member states, sort of like climate change policies. And I would like to sort of finish this observation of our focus groups with a comment that would directly link with the comment that Claudia made at the end of saying that it's sort of, it's not that the students don't see their responsibility to contribute to Europe. Something that I noticed in our focus group was somewhat linked, but not completely the same, is that when we ask them how do they feel that citizens can inform about the EU, and they noted that they know about the EU, they are students, they have courses on this, but they have their parents, the older generations, their relatives, that they feel that they lack knowledge about the EU. And what was striking for me was that although they said, okay, there can be, you can have more civic education, you can have more news in the media, but at the same time they said EU does a lot to promote their activities. You have all these structural funds that are promoted with science funded by EU. So it's actually a responsibility of citizens to get to notice this promotion and get informed. So there was a moment also where they recognized that the lot is done, but maybe citizens are not, should be more active in acknowledging this. Okay, so I'll finish with this and sort of give an opportunity for the other panelists to share about their countries.
Okay, I prepared some slides. I don't know how we proceed with the slides. I sent it. Anyway, it's here as well. I'm sorry.
Okay. So as for France, we conduct the focus groups with European Affairs master students in December 21 and December 22. And Willy and I will focus very briefly on two main results. So I will tweet the first one. We observe, as Claudia says at the beginning, as Meta underline 2, we observe less rejection of the EU than high expectation of it, or the perception of a gap between what it should do and what it can do. So we have many references to Europe's values, particularly when it comes to migration issues, and to the fact that they would only be defended on the surface. We also, which very much interest the Finnish focus groups. So, sorry. Some issues are common to both national groups and appear across the board in the various focus groups, while others relate to certain specificities. If we had time, if we have time after, we could discuss about the comparison perspective, the comparative perspective. So a critical relationship with Europe, precisely because it is important to them. The expectation we expressed are high and also fuel reflection on what Europe should be doing or doing better. So to develop and go further, we could insist on two dimensions. So firstly, the EU is part of the horizon of expectation and solution to the problems that these young people encounter or identify in the world. So for example, many participants talk about climate change, climate crisis as an expectation and an urgency for action. The common agricultural policy is also cited for its environmental, ecological, and food sovereignty issues, as well as for its long history, but and always linked to the fact that the EU is perceived as the level of action where solution can and must be found, we have also a lot of numerous members of the focus groups who also mentioned the single currency, freedom of movement, mechanisms such as Erasmus. Secondly, second dimension of this first result, big expectancies towards the EU, but a feeling of disappointment. There is common theme of a gap between expectation, ambition, and achievements, and the resources committed at the EU level. So first, the issue of tackling the migration question is found in the two national groups, and I think it's possible to find it in all the focus. Each time as an illustration of the gap between the EU's proclaimed values and the reality of its action. Students also express their frustration about what is done on climate change. And internationally too, Claudia cites 4 themes, so Ukraine, climate, and migration. And I can't remember the last one, but we've got the first 3 of those issues. So internationally too, the EU is out of step with its values. As a focus participant in Helsinki, for example, put it, the EU is not doing enough for global democracy, hypocrisy of the EU, EU proclaiming moral values around the world and democracy, but it's hypocritical in comparison to what EU does on migration issues and etc. And thirdly, to conclude, sometimes students also mention the solutions they imagine to bridge the gap between their expectation and the reality of the EU. So for example, the first focus group in Lajh insists on the need to move toward a more assertive federalism, capable of turning the Commission into a real government and the Parliament into a real parliament, and therefore of having a clearer, more accountable role. And in any case, the main problem is institutional and democratic for them. Also in Lajh, the participants repeatedly stress the importance of social policy, and we've got some images proposed to the students about social Europe. So in a nutshell, the EU's is great potential, fine words, but disappointing achievements, and should be reformed. And then
yeah, thank you. And so, as you see, as you heard, the often mentioned gap actually is has a double meaning, in fact, in reverse in the relationship between the EU, its elites, and its citizens. While for the EU elites, some of whom, including us, I mean, intellectual, professor, etc., the gap refers to the difference between what the EU does and what its citizens say or see. For the latter, for the citizens, it largely refers to what we are entitled to expect from the EU and what the EU actually does. So second thing we would like to underline with Cécile is on our focus group, the difficulties to understand the debate over European policy. Do we understand who are against who and why in Brussels? These points is related with 3 subdimensions. First, the idea that we need to change the way information about Europe is produced and the way information is circulates in Europe. And so expectation for political education about Europe, like civic education, likely to help citizens to better understand the issues at stake and how the institutions and European election work. There is a special question and issue about the way media write about Europe on their daily activities, and the observation that it is difficult to keep informed on European issues more generally. So there is something linked perhaps to or something linked with the difference of how we speak about Europe, how we educate people about Europe, and the way and the story of how national identity has been disseminated inside the whole society before. So questioning about civic education and school action about European question and information. Second point is a discussion on institutional aspects in relation with in relation to the culture of compromises in the European Union. Who governs is a difficult question to tackle, to understand. Debates and oppositions are difficult to read as conflicts around identified cleavages. Thirdly, element for discussion on the forms and methods of the electoral offer, which is considered as unsuitable. For example, politicians in European institutions are considered like out of touch, old-timers who have failed on at national level, who have no real motivation, implication for European affairs. The question of nationalized European election, which lead to false debate about European affairs and European stakes. It was present on Lyon focus groups. And some mechanism exists, but are not sufficiently effective to limit it, like, for example, a European citizen initiative. So according to the participant, it is hypocritical to ask for European investment of citizens in the EU because we need to look at the democratic mechanism themselves. For example, question of constituencies in France, considered too detached from the territories. Question of European European referendums or transnational elections, and the question again of how Europe is talked about in the media and in political world, how politicians are talking about Europe. And therefore, if depoliticization is an issue, a revival of politicization needs not only work on the European institutions, but also on the way in which its members are appointed and elected, surface and meaning of the election. That is what we can see or look in the French focus group in relation with the Finnish one, because we compare to Finnish, sorry, exactly. Finnish. Also, yeah, that's right. Thank you.
I have prepared some slides as a background information against which to present some preliminary results. Yeah, slides, presentation mode. Yeah. Okay, that's just the camera. Oh, sorry. Okay, I see. Okay, thanks. The research question that drove us in doing the focus groups in Bulgaria was what happens with the most informed citizens, students, BA, MA, but even PhD students who are well informed about the EU with regard to their attitudes to European institutions in a country that used to be the more the most pro-European country right after the accession of Bulgaria, which happened 15 years ago in 2007. Bulgaria was the most Euro optimist country in the club. You can see the data of trust in EU institutions according to Eurobarometer for Bulgaria. So we started with 58% of trust in EU institutions, and it dropped 10 points to 48%, basically reaching the average for all the European citizens. I have this comparisons. You can see the orange one is for Bulgaria, the bluish one is for Europe. Now, in 2023, Bulgarians have the same level of trust in EU institutions as the Europeans had 15 years ago. So we are now somehow catching up in not in an admirable competition, but that's the situation. So I also provided as a background information some data, very recent one from the last Eurobarometer, on how optimistic people are in the country with regard generally of how things are developing in the country. So Bulgaria is somewhere more on the positive side, with 41% believing that things are developing well for the country, and 30% believing that it is the opposite, which is actually better than most of the European countries. So it is relatively optimistic setting. I have other data with regard to age groups. How is trust in EU institutions spread across age groups? And you can see that among the young, 18 to 29, there has been a really strong support for the EU, and it was exactly like the average for the country. And now the young are exactly where the country average is. So the youth in Bulgaria is not much more pro-European than the rest of the population, though you see that the older generation is even less optimistic and even less trustful of EU institutions. So if there is a gap between citizens and EU institutions, we expect to see it among the youth as much as in the rest of the population. And we have also looked at data from 2015 to 2022 as regards trust in democracy. So Bulgarians still value positively and trust democracy better than alternatives, but this support is also eroding, not considerably, but still eroding. And looking at the most important problems for the country, you can see that most of those problems are not, it is not possible to solve them at the EU level. They are national problems that are to be solved by national institutions. And one data I didn't provide visual data is that trust in EU institutions among Bulgarians is much higher than trust in national institutions. And I think this is also the case in most other European countries. So one general question for our network to discuss is what explains this low trust in national institutions, and why trust in EU institutions, even though it is eroding, is still higher than in national institutions. So there is a gap for sure between citizens and institutions, but it doesn't only affect EU institutions, it affects national institutions as well. So with regard to the focus groups, we've held 2 focus groups, one in 2022 in June, and a second one 1 year later. And they were done with 6 students each, and it was a mixed group of students. All of them had some European integration or European studies classes, but were not necessarily focusing on EU issues. So they were well informed, but not specialists in that regard. The context, the immediate context in which the focus groups were held is characterized by several crises, two international level crisis and one national level crisis. The war in Ukraine broke out last year, so it provided a background for the focus group. Very importantly, political instability in Bulgaria was looming large. In the matter of 2 years, Bulgaria had 5 parliamentary elections. So we had 5 parliamentary elections between April 21 and April 23. So this political instability was also very, very visible in the discussions. This also, and the most important topics, according to the participants in the focus group, were the common market, the inadequacy of education, EU-related, but also general education, and issues of climate change that are not being addressed by institutions either at the EU or the national level. And I have provided some very brief comparison of what were the most important topics by participants in the first focus group. So you see common market. Common market is taking first place in the priority list of 3 out of 6 participants, but also climate change features relatively high in the priority of list of themes that are politicized or need to be politicized in order to be addressed by institutions. With regard to the second focus group, we have a relatively changed environment. War in Ukraine hasn't really been solved, so security and defense feature very high, as is featuring free movement and Erasmus. So with regard to the gap, there are different conceptualizations of the gap by the participants in the focus group. One issue that I'm not sure features in other focus groups is this feeling that there is a gap, not so much between citizens and the institutions, but between countries in the periphery of the EU and countries in the center of the EU. It was a common sentiment that was expressed was that basically in Bulgaria, nobody cares about what Bulgarians think of how to solve problems at the EU level. So we feel marginalized. And the EU was generally spoken as something foreign to Bulgaria. When we asked about how they feel, do they feel European or do they primarily feel Bulgarian? They would always say first Bulgarian, then European, because Europe is still a matter of future for us. It is still something to be realized. One other issue that thematizes the topic of the gap is educational gap. There was a perception expressed several times that with regard to EU issues, education is what matters most. So there is a gap in education between capital and the countryside, between more educated and less educated people. And the fear was also expressed that when people don't get adequate education, they fall victim to populist mobilizations that might erode the European Union. And lastly, some general observations. Actually, among the respondents, we had a predominantly pro-European participants, strongly pro-European. Only 2 out of 12 participants in the 2 focus groups expressed Eurosceptic, or rather I would say Euro-realist positions. And the topics that participants felt most warm about, excited about, was the free movement and the Erasmus program. And lastly, I would share that actually the participants have really diverse conceptions of what the EU means to them. There was this rationalist, realpolitik perspective. EU is something that we can use, that's something that produces output that is beneficial for us, particularly, but also for the country. So this was one perspective. There was, these two perspectives clashed quite considerably in the discussions. EU is a union of democratic values, and we should really try to enhance these democratic values and expect from the EU to act on those values. A third perspective related to the first one was that actually EU is just an economic union. And the fourth, related to the second, was that actually it's a union of equality and solidarity, something that is not being perceived well enough by citizens and is not being emphasized by both national and EU institutions. So there was this expectation on the part of those that expressed this conception of EU, that EU should do more to act on these values that are proclaimed in treaties and so on and so forth. So these are some preliminary observations from these two focus groups we held in Sofia with Sofia University students.
Okay, hello everyone. So these are some comments done from the Finnish focus group discussions that we organized with Kim. And so we had two master's level groups. One group was composed of Finnish-Swedish students. So because the students came from the Swedish School of Social Science at the University of Helsinki, which is a kind of separate institution, but part of the university. So we had one group of Finnish-Swedish students and then another international group where we had a German, Swiss, French and Bangladeshi students. So that was quite varied. One of the issues we had was to recruit the students for the focus group discussions. I mean, we had a very nice, service of tea, coffee, and biscuits, and offered also for them intelligent discussion, but that wasn't enough. But anyway, we succeeded in getting 4 students into each of these, groups. So that was fortunately that happened. So the small size is one question that I wonder, compared to some other groups where you have more people, what's the impact of that? Does it really matter? It's a question perhaps for Virginie, who knows more about this technique. So in general, one can say certainly that the older students were pro-EU and saw the disadvantages, like in other groups, in other countries, of EU mobility and Euro and Erasmus and so on. So there was no rejection of the EU in these groups. And they saw also the major challenges as being like in other groups, in other countries, climate change, migration, for instance. What is interesting, I mean, compared certainly to the French focus groups, is that there was less of this kind of thinking or reflection of what the EU should be or how the EU should be developed or anything of that kind. The students were much more practical and kind of pragmatic, but also there was also a sentiment of a bit like with the Bulgarian students of exteriority, that the EU is somewhere over there, sort of a bit somehow far away. There was also less discussion on how Finland could shape the EU or could be like more active or anything of that kind. And one of the things we thought about with Kim was that it would be interesting to relate, the discussion or the type of discussion that went on in this focus group to the media discussion that's going on in general, and to the political culture that you have in different countries, because in Finland the political culture is very sort of consensual and non-conflictual, and this kind of culture that perhaps somewhere in other countries might be a bit of a different kind of approach to the EU and to politics in general. Now, one thing that perhaps sort of comes out here in the discussions was that the emphasis on the difficulty of getting information on Europe, and that there was a sentiment that there was an informational deficit on European issues, which is perhaps not very surprising. And especially the international group emphasized, like the French students, the role of civic education, that there should be like, more, teaching on the EU and how it works, and the impact of the EU on national politics. And also in terms of the research, it could be perhaps interesting then to think more about the focus group discussions in the context of public discussion, sort of broader public discussion on the EU. Well, I think I'll stop here and give the microphone to my colleague here.
Thank you, Niilo. Yes, I'll continue just a bit on what you were saying here about context and taking that into consideration when interpreting the results. Yeah, I mean, just dwelling a bit further on using the Finnish context as an example of possible effects of political culture. Niilo already mentioned a few of these, but yeah, well, the stereotype of Finnish political culture is that it's very pragmatic, as in a small country, having balanced between the west and the east, or, well, should we say the over 1,000 kilometer border we had with Russia. And it's certainly a representative of the periphery, but a rather content one with the kind of Euro-realistic views. And in general, Finns have very high beliefs in their institutions in general, especially media institutions. That's amongst the highest in Europe. And so they're rather content with what they have rather than trying to change everything around in widespread protests. Could be perhaps contrasted to the French case with a very developed kind of protest culture. But also in a Nordic context, Finland stands out as the least critical Nordic member with compared to Sweden and compared to the older member Denmark. Also, Finland has joined the Euro, which the Finns are pretty relieved about, actually, when looking at their Nordic cousins. So yeah. And perhaps one reflection of this position may be the emphasis on democratic values of the EU, like being between East and West, emphasizing the democratic values of the EU and mentioning the authoritarian elements of Hungary and Poland as a threat to the EU, which the Finns actually brought out. And there was strong within the Finnish focus groups. But above all, also as Niilo related here about, small pragmatic steps that would be realistic for a small EU member to achieve. And there are indeed, like, comparatively quite small signs of discontent with the EU, and they don't, well, for instance, they don't go into how should we develop the EU in kind of bigger steps like for instance the French or the Germans do, and yes, so also global issues, climate change, all of these they came through, but they came through even stronger than in the international group. So this comparison between the two, I think that's been very fruitful, and I think we'll continue on that. also we have a value study of the Finns as a large group of the classes that we reported at the CPR. So we'll also continue a bit on that track, as in defining some basic values that the students have as a population compared to the total population. But yes, I think I'll finish here, and thank you for the floor.
Thank you, Kim. I want to report on a few things that surprised me in the Zagreb focus group, the Faculty of Political Science. We had two focus groups, one in March of 22, the other one in May of 23, both with master students who took European courses on the European Union. So one thing that is very similar to what the focus groups in Slovenia and in Bulgaria showed is this idea of democracy in the EU as a measure of how much each country has influence in the EU. So democracy was not understood only as we as researchers thought the relationship between citizens and the EU, but questions of democracy were also interpreted as how much Croatia as a country has an influence at the EU level and how much other smaller or let's say more peripheral countries have influence at the EU level. And the perception was that they do not have so much influence, and this was interpreted as a weakness in the democratic sense. On the other hand, of course, as in the Bulgarian case and in the Slovenian case, a high degree of awareness of the benefits of the EU. A lot of EU money is coming into Croatia, benefits of the open market, free travel, and everything that has been said so far. The second point I want to stress, and it has been discussed already, is this sources of information about the European Union. The students pointed out that their main source of information about the EU has been their university studies, their courses, the courses that they have taken on the EU, and in very sincere announcements, they admitted that they did not know how the EU functioned until they took a course on the political system of the European Union, which is a fifth-year course for political science students. So by their own admission, they did not know how institutions function. And then when they found out, when they learned, they expressed great skepticism about how ordinary people can understand the European Union if they, as political science students, only could understand it when having taken a course on that. Also, they have had experience in being interns in the European Parliament and other EU institutions, and this is also what they cited as a source of information about the EU. That was a bit of surprise to me also, as others have expressed surprise at this. But maybe it is not so surprising, having in mind that these are university students, that what they are, what they see as important is education. And the third thing was that I wanted to point out here is something that mostly surprised me in the student perception of the EU, especially when we're talking about how students perceive the weaknesses of the European Union, and what we as researcher it's visible in our questionnaire were after were weaknesses that were in this gap, this distance between EU and the citizens, this complexity of the institution, the lack of transparency, lack of democracy, and this is something that the EU, that the students did discuss about the European Union, but they identified, and it has been also discussed here, other weaknesses that I was not perceiving in this way, and several of them. First is the weakness of the EU in relationship to some of the member states that are opposing or resisting EU policies, namely Hungary and Poland. They saw that the EU cannot do anything about it, and they, as if they were asking that the EU should do something about it. The second weakness, they identified the standing of the EU in international relations. The weakness of the EU as EU, they noticed that EU representatives are welcomed or received much more lightly or with not as much importance as some national leaders, and the French president, Emmanuel Macron, was mentioned as somebody who has high standing in the international community as compared to, as I said, EU representatives. And connected to that, especially in the context of the Ukrainian war and crisis, and as it was mentioned in other cases, there was a plight for a common foreign and defense policy, even common defense forces of the European Union. And yeah, you know, it's like when you are in a team, you want your team to win, you want your team to be strong, you want your team to prevail. And they were having an impression that their team is not, maybe it's not prevailing, but their weaknesses. And the last weakness they identified is the weakness, or the last two, and they were also mentioned, weaknesses in promoting EU's values and policies. They noticed that the liberal democracy as a value and as a political system that the EU stands behind and promotes it is losing prestige in international context. And also that they spotted or they have perceived a weakness of the EU in implementing its own policies, as it was mentioned, especially climate policies. And students thought that the EU has, under the influence of some big industries or big companies, more powerful actors, is delaying or postponing or creating exceptions to its climate policies, and it's not being able to implement them as it is proclaimed. So yeah, that's I think what I think stood out from the Croatian focus groups. Everything else was quite similar to what was said. Great benefits from free movement, free travel, Erasmus, economic market, and all the rest that was already mentioned. Yeah, so thank you. Who has the floor next? But we're not going to give it to somebody to okay. And there's somebody there who wants to comment. Okay.
Thanks a lot for all the presentations. So I will try to react and comments. And my first reaction will be to really congratulate you to have done all this fieldwork. I have been asked by one of your colleagues how many focus group I did on the EU, so I count, and I did participate to more than 40. So I have to say that I'm very, you know, how would I say, impressed, yeah, by what you did, and also the journey was long, so I will try to find my word in English. But when you said it was difficult, I was like, yeah, it's difficult to do focus group. It's difficult to do focus group on the EU, and you have been facing this with students, with master students who have time, who in a way want to discuss the EU because they do this, and still it was difficult. And I think that that's the first thing that we need to acknowledge, that if you want to discuss the debate about the EU, all that is made now as deliberation has a strong cost. And the cost comes from the fact that it's difficult to deliberate, but it's also coming from the fact that the EU is very complex. And I think that this is one of your main results, and it should be said, and it's an important result. And this leads me to my first main comments. And Claudia said at the beginning that you decide to move to this specific public because of COVID and because of the difficulty. And I think that indeed you should make a strength out of this in order to really assess what we know about debating the EU and reverse a little bit the fact that it was a weakness to a strength, and to say, Niilo, you mentioned it could be not surprising that those, you know, had difficulties of discussing and they were discussing information. I think that for social, you know, politics or for sociologists, not a surprise. But I think that for stakeholders, it should be a surprise to them, because they do think that it's something that it's easy to be done, to discuss and to dialogue. And you show us with the most usual suspect of wanting to discuss that it's not the case. So I think that the first thing is really to use this to discuss this question about informational gap, not, you know, not taking a shy position about it, but really to use the tool that you had to look at the mechanism behind this fact that there is an information difficulties with the EU. And I think that here, what you mentioned about the fact that you have a kind of informed criticism is something that you could build on in order to develop these mechanisms. So for example, our colleague Ari Murelman, and he did some focus group in different countries, and he arrived to the fact that some citizens are uninformed and therefore depoliticized. So I think that here what you show us is not exactly the same, even if there is a common ground about the fact that information is a gap. So I think that by comparing, by trying to understand what are the differences between the specific public that you had, which should be the most informed, the most interested, and still you find this gap. So I think that it's really important. And this is a kind of distance that has been really part of many other research using focus group and not Eurobarometer's data set. So there are many research out there who you can rely on. So the second thing that I was struck by is really this discrepancy, and you mentioned it in the French case, and also you just mentioned it in the Croatian case at least, is this discrepancy between practice, policies, and the values and the ideal of Europe. And again, this is something that has been found by, for example, our colleagues Marine de la Salle, Daniel Gaxi, but also in the focus group that we did in 3 countries, we arrived with this idea of an ambivalence between, you know, what's real and what's its ideal about the EU. And again, I think that you could really use the fact that we should not really necessarily expect this from this kind of public to build on this and to try to develop the mechanism that there is a discrepancy between policies and values. And I think that the word that you use are important, because as social scientists, we say between practices and ideals, but I think that practice are policies, and citizens do see policies because they say policies are not made as we expect them to be done. So I think that moving from practice is also something that we can contribute to by saying, it's not true that they don't see, that they don't have expectation. You mentioned, I think it was really about the social policies that we're expecting from the French students. This is really something that it's you know, the word that they use is policies. It's not something that is out of context. So I think that it can also help us to rethink politicization in terms of policies output and not just, you know, debate political actors that are for right and left. It's really about solution making and how they can arrive to this. Then I had two comments on the context and the exteriority of the Finnish case and also the Croatian case and the Bulgarian case. I think that you mentioned that they felt, you know, out of the EU. And here it made me thought about the fact that when we did some focus group with the British case, they found themselves really out of Europe. They were part of it, but still, and it was in 2005, but they were like, are we in Europe? Are you sure? Because I think that Switzerland is inside, but we are not. We don't have the euro. So I think that this exteriority is something that also should be pushed forward to really show how far we are from also the discussion that are taking place in some level. Then the second sub-comment was on the context, and you mentioned that, Kim, and also others. And here it's more a methodological point and a way to answer Niilo's direct question to me about is it a problem to have 4 persons in one focus group or to have 2 focus groups per country? And it's a problem for me if you want to say something about those groups as a way to generalize to the country or to something else. When it's not a problem, I think it's when you find again and again the same thing. When you focus on the common mechanism, it's methodologically totally valid to say that it happens in Finland, it happens in Croatia, it happens with your most educated people, and it happens with the ordinary citizens that we discuss too. And then you can say something theoretically, empirically about what is the gap and how we should understand it. So coming back to the context, you have the war in Ukraine. You have indeed all these debates about the climate change. We had the constitutional treaty debate in many countries at that time. When we did the focus group in 2019, we had the Brexit and the European election. But still, we do arrive to the same conclusion. So if you discuss with colleagues, they will say, yes, but now with the war in Ukraine, that will be different. You know, they see Europe, they see how it's important. You show us in a way that yes, it's part of how they discuss Europe, but it's not enough to really understand how politicization and depoliticization about the EU is taking place. So I think that the contextual element should be also a strength of EU discussion by saying, okay, it's war in Ukraine, but still we do find this mechanism. And finally, I do have 1 or 2 questions, and I will do my best or 1 comment and 1 question, and I will do my best to also give some insights tomorrow if I have the time tonight, because reacting, you know, like this is not always easy. But I think that you mentioned, Kim, that it is interesting to link that to the political culture. And here I would like to just tell you a short anecdote about the focus group that we did when I was very, very young doing my PhD, so not so far away, but still. And in fact, we did some focus group in France, and then we moved to Belgium. And I went to France to organize some of the focus group with Sophie Duchesne and Florence Hegel, who were the PI of this project. And I was just a doctoral student, and I arrived there and I observed 1, 2, 3 focus groups. And then I said to Sophie and Florence, you will never have that in Belgium. You will never have people fighting and shouting and disagreeing like this, because they were interested in conflict as a way of looking at politicization. And they said, you will see. And then we did the focus group in Belgium, and there was no conflict. Not meaning that there was no disagreement, but there was no open conflict. People were able to say, you know, Niilo, I would totally agree with you, but, and after the but, it was totally the opposite side. In the French case, some people just identified that the people in front of them was, you know, not from the same political view or coming from another social backgrounds. And they, even if they agree, they disagree. And I know that it seems caricatural, but the anecdote that I want to go through is that when we discussed this afterwards, the results, the conclusion was that Sophie Duchesne and Florence Hegel rewrote the theoretical article that they had on politicization in order to add another time of politicization based on the consensus case of Belgium and how people, in fact, are able to discuss politics in other ways, still very politicized, but not based on conflict. So I think that what you mentioned is really important also to understand all the things. And finally, I do have a question to you all, and I'm sure that I will come to with other questions tomorrow. My question is that you really emphasize a lot the fact that your public are students. But I didn't hear so much about the fact that they are young. And I think that you cannot just get rid of this characteristic of your public. So when you come to climate change, when you say we need solutions, those are young people, and you will find exactly the same. So one doctoral student of mine did some focus group in Brussels with young people, and I'm really sorry that Cécile is not here because she did some interviews with young people in the 90s. And many things that you find is also linked to the fact that young people are not yet, politicized as others. And so I think that you should also keep that in mind. The idea that you have climate change very present, I think that it's not an issue. It's just, how today they see Europe. So Erasmus is an evidence, but I think that also for when you will arrive to the point that you want to publish, you want to contribute to this idea of a gap between elites and citizens, but also to rethink politicization, I think that they are young people. So if you have different age, of course, it will change, but I think that they are not just students. They are really young people, and it's the same. So I would like to hear you a little bit about this, if you have any thought about that. But thank you very much for your presentation. It was really great. And you had a question? Okay. Any questions? Sure. So first of all, sorry for Julian and me having heated conversations aside. We wanted to desperately find a restaurant for tonight. So something seems to be happening in Fulda. So I think poor Julian called about 15 restaurants. We have found one. So we will not be starving, but even the most secure choices were not working. So I'm afraid it's not outside, but we found a restaurant. So this is why we were, I was consulting Google Maps and all that. It's not that I was not listening, but I didn't want us to starve. The point about the young people. So that is a point that I made. And this is really something that I would like to take up in our final reflections. So there are a couple of things that I would like us to take up in our final reflections. And we can show you tomorrow. We have done a tentative plan for the publication that should be coming out. And we would like to have it a conceptual part. We would like to discuss a number of concepts. Politicization, obviously one of them. But also the opposite, depoliticization and technocracy, which I think is more and more important in the EU. Also add a criticism of the concept of Euroscepticism, because I think all our findings speak against a simplest concept of Euroscepticism. But in the concept of politicization and in the concept of the gap, which has kind of been a leading concept. So we really, I think, ended with some very fruitful distinctions today. So for the gap, we ended up saying, let me look up my notes, that it's a fourfold gap. Let me find this quickly. And I think that's very interesting. So it's a gap between center and periphery of the EU. It's a gap between informed and uninformed citizens. And that is linked to a kind of social stratification gap. But it's not exactly linked. Yeah, so we have the informed and the uninformed citizens, we have the rich and poor, or the losers and winners of EU integration. And I think that's a very important category. Then we have EU center versus EU periphery. This is something that clearly came up in our discussions, that the politicization and the gap is framed differently. And then we have this gap that was the gap at the outside, the gap between at the outset, of the project, between EU institutions and EU citizens. So that is sort of one thing. And then I think we have various modes of politicization. And we got very interesting comments on how to react to the gap. And one thing that, I admitted today that it leaves me puzzled with my students often, is the reaction to that kind of thing. Because it's very much upward oriented.
So what the students said in their reaction was, okay, the EU should do more. There should be more education, there should be more social media, there should be more communication. And this is sort of what I think Meta said in her first reaction. It really sort of, it was not a natural reaction for the students to say, okay, let's do something about it. So we were telling funny stories of 68 and, you know, burning barricades and all that kind of thing. And the reaction of all the students in all of the focus groups is not anyway near they are so far away from possibly burning any barricade as you can imagine. They don't even think they have an agency. Sort of the more I think about it, the more I would come to this point. And this is something that I also realize in university politics here, very much this mentality. And I think this is age related. And before we started this discussion, we have been discussing about what could be the possible explanations for that. Actually, I think it's a very decisive finding, because these students, they are politicized, so they have strong opinions on migration, on COVID, on the climate crisis. So they really would wish for more action, but it's somehow disconnected from their agency. And so I desperately asked our, well, former students, so the younger generation sitting over there, Anjali Geiselhardt, who joined us for the workshop and who did a master's, an excellent master's on the topic with me, and Julian, who is now a doctoral student. So more or less, almost still students, and they weren't really sort of able to explain that sign of the time. So it's a kind of a strange, it's a gap there also. It's a kind of, I don't know, agency gap with this generation. And I don't know where it comes from, but I think it's a fascinating finding. Anybody wants to join in? Is somebody monitoring what the online participants are saying? There's something in the chat. Okay. So the online participants, if you want to ask a question, just put it in the chat. If not, that's fine. Yeah, please. It's a discussion with the advisory board. By the way, we had a second member of the advisory board, Céline Belot, who can't be present because she has COVID.
Yeah, and that's really a pity because, as I mentioned, Céline did really, some work on young people. So I think that she could contribute. And I mentioned the PhD of mine. Her name is Heidi Mersenier, and she has been publishing a great article on this. Also a PhD, for those who speak French, is really a great PhD. And something that we find also in my ERC project on very different topic. I think that it's come back to the fact that those public that you have discussed with are young and they are from a specific generation. And the agency question and the politicization and depoliticization question is not about the EU only. It's a question about individualism as well. They do believe that we have as individual a responsibility to do many things, and it's not institution, it's not policies that should do this. And we find this in the ERC project on very different topics. So it's the same on other topics, this lack of agency. They don't believe that they can do something politically. So for the climate, for example, they do believe that they need to do something as individuals, as consumers, as young people, as whatever, but it doesn't come to the fact of how we understand politics. And this is where I think that you should link the two, and the project that I mentioned, this is also the direction that we go to, and this is why I emphasize that we need also to look at policies. I think that it comes through our definition of politicization. Politicization could not be about, or depoliticization as well, about politics. It's about choice, it's about agency. And for that, it's not a question of politician as we think of. It's not a question about political institution. It's about who can make the decision. And in what I will present tomorrow, you will see that in our case, most of the citizens don't believe that it's political actors who can do something. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think that this is probably I'm not clear again. The journey was long, but this is exactly what I meant. I think that it's also rethinking how we think about depoliticization, and this is why I really like the book of Colin Hay, Why We Had Politics, because it does have 3 different moments when you do have depoliticization, and one of those is indeed to say, you know, it's not a collective problem, and I do believe that part of the young generation do understand the problem, but they don't see this as a political problem in the other sense. So and again, they don't think that they have agency. So they don't, you know, not political agency. Yeah, also in the institution. Yeah, exactly. So it's not, this is why and the terminology is not yet there. Otherwise, I would also have published something on this, but I think that there is something wrong in our understanding of what politicization and depoliticization is. I think that we put too much emphasis on debate, on deliberation, also on institutions. And I think that what, you know, you participant, but also ours said is that, you know, politics is about problem solving. It's about who should find a solution. And there they are very clear about the fact that it's not the EU in their view, or it's not themselves. It's a problem so I think that agency and choice are key to understand what politicization is. So I do agree with you more than, you know, debate, being for, against, or.
But can I jump in there directly? So your thesis is that because many people perceive politics not as an area where decisions are made, politicization is not about politics. But what about what is it then when it's not about politics?
It's still about agency in the sense that they should have solution.
Okay.
They could be elites, they could be political actors and all that, but it's not about this solution versus this one. It's not about you know, these parties taking position. It's really about finding a solution, doing something.
Okay, but why, what is your explanation for this fact that apparently a lot of people don't believe to have any agency themselves? Why is that?
I will give you the micro, but there, and I will go on the project that we have. I think that it's part of change that occur in societies that are bigger than just politics. And I think that neoliberalism and individualism have played a big role in that. And also for policy, for example, if you go back to who is doing the policies, but in some countries, it's not anymore the institution, it's the market, you know, it's more and more. So I think that those change has also an impact. And in that case, the impact on generation is really important. They are not the same generation as others.
My hypothesis is the issue of lack of agency, because we had an explicit question in the second round of Roundtable. What can we do? What do you think you can influence the most with regard to the problems you find most important, more divisive, and so on and so forth? And because the participants were political science, in my case, political science students, they always think to institutions. They are very state-centered. So they expect big problems to be solved by big institutions. So that's natural for them. If I would do the same with sociology students, they would rather, and I've had classes with sociology students, they don't have this attitude. Rather, they think through collective mobilizations, things that groups can do. But political scientists, they speak and think institutions. So in my case, for the whole generation, because I only had political science students.
Just a comment on the fact that we don't know what our students do outside the university. So maybe we have in mind that they are defeated, that they feel apathy, but maybe they act in different ways. And it could be very interesting to have those information also to be able to understand how they feel, and if they are completely convinced that democracy is not a solution, that EU is completely unable to solve the problem, or if they try to, as some colleagues observed in other countries, as they try to observe in Russia, for example, now, if they try to explore alternatives behavior to express how they feel concerning, for example, war in Ukraine, or how they feel concerning the climate crisis. But I don't know, in fact, for my students, if I try to remember who they are, I know that some of them are really engaged in some association, NGO, for example, to tackle environmental issues. And okay, so it could be interesting to have those things also in mind when we are talking about their apathy or, you know, but still, yeah. Mm. 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 Mm.
Yeah, I mean, it has been a long day, not only for Virginie, and actually this was scheduled to go until 7:30. So I think we might as well call it a day. Yeah, just to be, it has been a long day, yeah, but I think this has been a fascinating discussion. So we have been registering it, and I think it will be definitely worth rewatching it. Yeah, because I think we have a lot of ideas that sort of popped up that are very interesting. I'm really, really glad that you are here, and I'm also very much looking forward to hear more about your project tomorrow, because I think it will really be very nicely complementary. So, yeah. So all good. For the audience that is online, there is another discussion round tomorrow at 9. So we start our working day tomorrow with another discussion round, which will be on concepts. It will be on politicization, it will be on Euroscepticism, and it will be on your new project, which I think will also have a large conceptual part in it. So yeah, so this is what we do tomorrow. And then there is for the closing of the day tomorrow, there is a discussion that will probably be half German, half English, on the question of what we can do to close this gap. So we will have tomorrow at 5 here in this room, Marianne Müller from Pulse of Europe, Thomas Berger from Europe Direct in Fulda, a representative from the Europa Union. It has been going a big back and forth, so I'm not really sure who is coming in the end. And Muriel Pluschke, who is a doctoral student in this university, who will present some results from her research. She worked on local newspapers and how they report about the EU. So we will see if we can find some practical remedies to the messes that we have been discussing today. Thanks a lot to everybody. Thanks a lot for the online audience of being there, and I hope to see you all around.